Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. We're just going to take another 30 seconds or so to wait for people to join the meeting, and then we'll get started.
Hi, Rob. It's nice to see your name as well as your face today.
It's great to see familiar faces on the call. Hi, Shandy. Okay, let's get started. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining our webinar today, CID 101 with CID Curriculum Director Eric Wada and his colleague, Miguel Rother. I'm Marisa Chung, Program Officer with the California Education Learning Lab, and with me from the Learning Lab team are the Programs Director, Lark Park, and Program Officer, Rob Charette. I have a few housekeeping notes before we get started. Our guest speaker will be presenting for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session. Please remain muted, and if you have a question or comment during the presentation, you can use the chat feature, and my colleague Rob will be monitoring the chat. We may break for a couple questions during the presentation as appropriate. Closed captioning is enabled if needed. We are recording the webinar, and we'll send the link to all of those of you who are registered, and we'll also post the recording to our website. In case you aren't familiar with the Learning Lab, we are a state-funded grant-making organization with a mission to improve learning outcomes and close equity gaps for students who attend the California community colleges, CSUs, and UCs. We provide grants to faculty teams, primarily in STEM disciplines, to spur faculty innovation, whether regarding curriculum and pedagogical approaches, development of adaptive learning technologies, and/or improving teaching in online or hybrid formats. Many of our projects seek to improve success in STEM gateway courses. Oh, excuse me. I had to just enable transcription. Sorry about that. Many of our projects seek to improve success in STEM gateway courses, so you can begin to understand the relevance of CID approval. We've heard from current grantees that navigating the approval process can be tricky, the main reason why we're hosting this webinar. The webinar may also be helpful to prospective applicants of Learning Lab's current grant opportunity designed to close the calculus equity gap. Applicants may be proposing to redesign courses in the calculus sequence, which may require CID approval for transfer. And Rob is going to put the link to our RFP in the chat. Now I'd like to introduce Eric Wada, CID Curriculum Director, who serves as a liaison to faculty on CID-related matters and oversees approval processes. Eric will provide a brief story behind the course numbering system, share important CID who's who, and explain the process for course approvals. Eric is also a professor of biology at Folsom Lake College. And as mentioned, with Eric today is his colleague, Miguel Rother, the Director of Grants and Initiatives for the Academic Senate of the California Community Colleges. Thank you both for joining us today. Eric, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Marisa. Thank you all for being here today for many of you, this is probably still winter break, so what better to do than to spend time learning about CID. I wanted to get a sense of who's in the audience today, and I did not have the foresight to put a Zoom poll together, but if you go down to the bottom of your screen, you'll probably see something that says reactions. And under reactions, you'll have the opportunity to raise your hand and to lower your hand. And you can use that if you wanted to call attention to bring a question up during the webinar as well. But I wanted to get a sense of how many of you were from the community college system. If you wouldn't mind going to the reactions and raising your hand. It seems that, and you can, I think, go to the participants and you'll be able to see how many people have indicated a positive response. So it looks like the majority of people are, or at least half, more than half are from the community college system. Okay, great. You can lower your hands now. And I'm interested in the next question here once we get the responses back to zero here. Of those of you from the community college system, how many of you are faculty? So raise your hand if you're faculty. we see again about slightly more than half. Okay, great. Go ahead and lower your hands. And then the last question I have is, for how many of you is CID a relatively new topic? So I'm interested in sort of your own self-assessment with how you are with CID and how familiar you are with it. So how many of you CID is fairly new to you? Okay, looks like we're at about 26 or so out of 71. And okay, great. Thanks very much. So it looks like a lot of folks are in the right place. So Miguel is going to run the presentation for me. So thank you, Miguel. Miguel, also, I want to acknowledge the work that Miguel has done over the years with CID. He's very experienced with CID and will certainly help fill in some gaps if I don't have the answer to a particular question. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide here. This will give an overview of our presentation today. As Marisa mentioned, this is an overview of CID. I'll give a brief background and history and governance of CID. We'll talk about the role of faculty, discipline faculty in what are called faculty discipline review groups. These are sort of the center of CID curriculum. We'll talk a little bit about what CID descriptors are and how this intersects with both transfer and articulation. A lot of what the Learning Lab seems to do is to support curricular innovation. And so I wanted to address a little bit about how curricular innovation and CID can intersect as well, before finally focusing on how CID is useful for associate degrees for transfer. So if we go to the next slide here, it's a brief background of CID. CID is a supernumbering system, means that it's a course numbering system that stands above what community colleges may offer locally. So if you have, for example, Math 1A at one college and Math 300 at another college, it's a way to identify which courses might be similar between colleges with different numbering systems. It does not currently dictate what colleges or how colleges should number their curriculum. It's a way to sort of allow for assessment of course outlines against a set of course descriptors that are in existence to show which courses might be equivalent or similar. CID predates what's known as the transfer model curriculum. Transfer model curricula and associate degrees for transfer were established by SB 1440 back in 2010. Associate degrees for transfer, many of you are familiar with these. These are degrees that can provide preferential admission to the California State University system. And they're based largely on these templates that are called transfer model curricula. If you go to our CID webpage, you'll be able to see those TMC templates in addition to the CID descriptors as well. And if there's time at the end, if there's an interest, we can certainly help navigate those for those of you for whom CID might be newer. Because CID is largely a curricular project, the best people to be involved in the governance of this are the faculty discipline experts. And so we have faculty who are really the approving and decision-making groups involved in the governance of CID. We have an intersegmental curriculum work group, which oversees mostly the policies related to the programs, the transfer model curriculum and associate degrees for transfer. There's within that intersegmental curriculum work group, which is a large group that consists of faculty and other education practitioners from higher education systems. We have a subgroup called the intersegmental curriculum faculty work group, who is the voting membership of ICW. There's a CID advisory group, which makes decisions about CID policies related to review, development of CID descriptors. CID descriptors are more of the course level aspects of curriculum, whereas TMCs are more of the program level. So they're kind of they're both related to curriculum, but are at different levels. I mentioned earlier that there are voting members. These are appointed by the respective academic senates from the California community colleges and the California State University. So each academic senate has their own process for recruiting and appointing faculty to serve as voting members on these governance groups. And I also mentioned earlier that we do have other education practitioners from our system chancellor's offices, from the community colleges, and from the CSU system, who serve in advisory roles. A lot of our work could not be done without the guidance and expertise of articulation officers from both the community college system and from the California State University. And because CID has sort of, and the associate degrees for transfer have sort of become more broadly applicable, not just to the California State University, but we do have some private colleges and universities in the state of California who will accept students earning associate degrees for transfer. We have a representative from the private colleges and universities of California, and a more recent memorandum of understanding with historically Black colleges and universities across the country. Some of those institutions also accept students with associate degrees for transfer, and so we're looking to increase membership there. And then finally, the UC certainly also has an interest in CID sometimes, and so we have a UC faculty member in an advisory role as well. I mentioned earlier that a lot of this is curricular in nature, and so when we have a need to design curriculum, review curriculum, it has to be done with a discipline expertise lens. And so we incorporate faculty discipline review groups, and we have several of these. The next slide will talk about the organization and roles of these faculty discipline review groups. So we'll call them FDRGs. A lot of curriculum uses acronyms, so it's alphabet soup, so bear with me. FDRGs consist of faculty members, discipline faculty, faculty from related disciplines, from the community college and from the CSU system. We also have articulation officers who will serve in advisory roles on these FDRGs as well. FDRGs typically meet early on when there's an interest in developing new curriculum in a discipline that doesn't currently exist in CID. And then also periodically, we have a review process to ensure that curriculum remains relevant, not only to transfer, but also in terms of how knowledge evolves in a field, how students access the knowledge, ensuring that there's equity and inclusion and anti-racism in the curriculum as well. We want to make sure that that's part of our process. So the bullets under the functions there, the main roles of the FDRG are to develop or modify CID descriptors. So these are the courses again, and determine if after a 5-year review, whether if there are changes to those descriptors, whether those changes are substantial in nature, requiring that any courses that are previously submitted to CID are required to be resubmitted. Above all, CID is meant to serve the function of facilitating transfer, not only within the segments within the community college segment of higher education, but also between segments of higher education, particularly from the community colleges to the CSU. The FDRGs also have a responsibility for oversight of the transfer model curricula. And so we want to make sure that the program curriculum is also relevant for CSU transfer. More recently, there's been an interest in ensuring that students who are pursuing an associate degree for transfer can be adequately prepared not only for transfer to the CSU, but also to the UC as well. Some of you might be familiar with the UC transfer pathways. UC transfer pathways exist in 20 disciplines and outline the common preparation that would be necessary to transfer to the UC system in those 20 disciplines. And so where there's overlap between transfer pathways to the CSU and transfer to the UC, we're interested in making that well known to students so that keeps their options open. If they hadn't considered transferring to the UC previously, but they were on an ADT pathway, it gives them that option if they wanted to pursue it. And then finally, we're absolutely interested that the curriculum remains relevant and accessible to the students in our system of higher education. Community colleges are a very diverse, we serve a diverse group of students. We want to make sure that the curriculum is culturally relevant, inclusive, accessible, and equitable. And the way we're trying to accomplish that is by ensuring that this content is included in our CID descriptors. And as colleges develop their curriculum locally, that they're encouraged to include this, include culturally relevant curriculum in their local course outlines by showing commitment to that importance in the CID descriptors as well. I mentioned previously, I think, the membership of the Fdrgs. It really does center around disciplined faculty who are appointed by the respective academic senates from the California Community College system and also from the CSU. So I wanted to pause there because that gives sort of an overview of the governance and the organization of CID to see if there are any questions before moving on. So I see a hand raised from Anne. Go ahead.
Good morning. Just a quick one. There are two suggestions as to where we should post questions, whether we should use Otter or if we should use the chat or just wait for moments like this to pose a question.
My preference is, of course, pose a question verbally. However, I do have Rob and Miguel monitoring the chat as well. It's best to put it in chat, I'd imagine.
Yeah.
Okay, then, oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, we aren't using Otter. We are, Learning Lab is using the chat for questions.
Okay, I have a very quick question, and that is in reference to the bullet point about ensuring that the curriculum is culturally relevant, accessible, and equitable. I'm just wondering, is there a particular template or guideline that the groups are using for that purpose? And if so, could that be shared with all of us?
So as a part of that, part of the review process involves surveying disciplined faculty from the CSU and from the California community colleges. And so if you're subscribed to the, if you're from the community college system and you're subscribed to the ASCCC listservs that are discipline specific, or to some of the broader listservs, for example, we have a curriculum listserv as well. Announcements about the 5-year vetting are sent to those listservs. The surveys that we submit, that we send out to the field include questions asking the discipline faculty to provide us some guidance on what types of anti-racist or culturally relevant curriculum should be included in the CID descriptors. It's up to the Fdrgs to review those survey responses and make appropriate changes to the CID descriptors. We imagine that there are going to be differences in how this will manifest itself in curriculum. And so we don't have a specific template yet. However, because we ask these pointed questions and we ask the Fdrgs to really consider the input from the discipline faculty, we are trying to make sure that we get a good cross-section of ideas from faculty from the community colleges and the CSUs.
Thank you. Awesome. Thanks.
Okay, so let's move on then to the next question. I apologize. I know that there are questions popping up in the chat likely, and so we will have time at the end to make sure that we address those. So let's go to the next slide here, and we'll start talking more about the descriptors. So as I mentioned, descriptors are courses. The courses are aligned with descriptors. As of recently, we have 57 different disciplines in which we have CID descriptors. 15 of those are for community colleges only, and those are typically career technical education disciplines. The rest of them are transferable to the CSU system or other segments of higher education that offer baccalaureate degrees. I wanted to say a note on transfer. Because CID is primarily used to facilitate transfer between the community colleges and the CSUs, that's why we have the Fdrg membership consisting primarily of community college and CSU faculty. But we do recognize that there are other segments of higher education who do have interest in CID as well. And I wanted to acknowledge those, as I mentioned before, the private colleges in California, some of the historically Black colleges and universities around the country as well. The next slide will say a little bit more about the layers of transfer. CID is one component of how transfer can be facilitated between segments of higher education. And for this discussion here, I'm really focusing on the on transfer between the community colleges and the CSU and the UC. So there are different layers of transfer. All transferable courses must first be at baccalaureate level. They have to be something that would be considered applicable to a BA or a BS degree. Once a course is determined to be transferable as a baccalaureate level course, at a minimum, it's going to be considered for elective credit that can be applied towards the unit minimums or unit requirements to receive a bachelor's degree. I'll say a little bit more later about the importance of consulting with your articulation officer on what it means to be baccalaureate level, because baccalaureate level at the CSU versus the UC, there are different processes as well, but I won't get too much into the weeds there. The next bullet addresses GE, or general education. Courses may count for GE if they're determined to be baccalaureate level. And there are two separate review processes for the CSU general education and for IGETC. So there are independent review processes for those two types of general education. And I also want to really emphasize that GE approval is independent of CID. So just because CID says that a course is equivalent to a descriptor, that doesn't mean that that same course that a community college develops is also applicable for GE. So those are entirely separate processes. The opposite is true too. Just because a course is approved for GE doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be applicable to CID. The last level of articulation, and so this is perhaps the most specific, is articulation for major prep. And so as part of a baccalaureate program, there's a requirement that students take certain lower division courses that will prepare them for upper division coursework. And for students who are transferring to other segments of higher education, these types of courses are typically taken at the community college. Historically, these sorts of articulation agreements for major prep are done on a campus by campus basis and on a department by department basis. These sorts of agreements, because they're done on a very specific level, really the work here rotates around your local articulation officer and the articulation officer at a four-year college to facilitate the dialogue between discipline faculty members to come to agreement on these on these major level articulations. As far as how CID fits into this, CID is most similar to this last level of transferability. Because community colleges will submit course outlines to CID for a review against a CID descriptor, and these CID descriptors are often applicable to associate degrees for transfer. CID is a way to sort of streamline these college by college, department by department articulation agreements by enabling the CSU system, for example, to look at the CID descriptor and say, this course looks similar to what we would require a student to take, for example, in biology. And if your community college course is approved for the CID descriptor, we will then accept this CID descriptor as equivalent to our biology course that would be required for the major. So it streamlines that sort of review process. Okay, so the next slide, I believe, talks a little bit about the content of descriptors themselves. We have CID descriptors for individual courses and for sequences of courses. And my understanding is that in STEM disciplines, courses are highly sequenced, and the curriculum can sort of be broken apart in many different ways. And you'll see, for example, that in some of the STEM disciplines, there are individual descriptors, for example, for the first semester of chemistry and the second semester of chemistry. But if colleges may have differences in how they break up that content from semester to semester, or if they're on the quarter system, for example, we have a year-long sequence that a community college can submit their curriculum against for review. In terms of what goes into these descriptors, there's a minimum set number of units that are required to meet that descriptor. There may be prerequisites as well. There is definitely content and course objectives. We recognize that there is going to be differences, local stylistic differences in how the content and objectives will appear on a course outline of record. And we also recognize that not all course outlines of record have their student learning outcomes in the course outline. They may be attached as an appendix. And so our review process has that, has the reviewers keep that in mind as they are reviewing course outlines. CID descriptors also indicate typical assignments and assessment methods in a course that would align with the CID descriptor. And then finally, textbooks. We're encouraging that we require that textbooks are recent and are encouraging, where appropriate, the use of open educational resources as well in any discipline. Okay, so that is a little bit on just the background of CID descriptors. I wanted to again pause here before talking a little bit about the review process, if there were any questions about CID descriptors or transfer and articulation. Okay, then what we'll do is we'll move on to the next slide, which will address the CID review process. Oh, sorry, I see Sarah. Yeah, go ahead.
Sarah, your microphone's not working. We can't hear you. Your mouth is moving, but we hear nothing.
We had something, but it was not, we couldn't hear.
Yeah, feel free to use the chat, Sarah.
Sorry about that.
Eric, while we wait, we have a question in the chat from Ann Foster. It says, are the assignments on a CID descriptor required or representative?
It depends on how the descriptor is worded. There are certain disciplines in which they might say that a lab report is required. In that case, given the wording, that would be a requirement. But otherwise, without very specific wording to that effect, those would be representative examples of assessments and assignments. Okay, did we get
oh, go ahead.
Oh, okay. No, Sarah wanted to point out that there are questions in the chat. So we'll get to those there in, I guess, at the end here. So let me go go through the rest of the presentations. Maybe some of those will be addressed in the coming slides as well. Okay, so regarding the review process, so we have, as I mentioned, course outlines of record are written locally at each of your colleges. Those are then submitted by your articulation officer to CID for review. The people who review are called course outline of record evaluators. Course outline of record evaluators are disciplined faculty who are appointed by the respective academic senates from the California community colleges or from the CSU. So we have one reviewer from the community colleges, one reviewer from the CSU. There's the possibility for a tie in that case. And so we have a primary reviewer who is there to reconcile any differences and or break ties. I mentioned very briefly earlier that we recognize that course outlines of record will differ from college to college. And we coach our reviewers to do an independent and holistic review of the course outline of record submitted. So recognizing that objectives are not universally located, or the wording of objectives is not, consistent across community colleges, we want our reviewers to look at the entire course outline and use their professional judgment from a disciplined faculty lens to see whether the CID objectives would be met if the course outline of record was taught at a local college. So with that said, we do not require that course outlines match the CID descriptors. As a matter of fact, I personally would encourage that there is difference between the CID descriptor and local curriculum because it shows that someone locally has put their own discipline expertise into the course outline and uses what they think is going to meet their local student population's needs. The next slide will talk about the fact that, or maybe it was another one. No, it's on a later slide, but I'll mention it here. CID descriptors are a minimum, all right? So it's possible to have more than what's in the CID descriptor. And looking at our CID webpage, you'll look at the descriptors and you'll see that the content appears as a bulleted list of topics that for many disciplines, you'll probably find that those are very broad topics. For example, in biology, we'll say something about biotechnology being a requirement as a course, as a content item in a majors level course. And biotechnology is, of course, a very broad discipline with a lot of different applications. And so evidence of that is what we'd be looking for in that discipline. So regarding the review process, there are different determinations that can result from a review. The first, the one you're probably looking for, is an approved determination. And this is showing that the local course outline is aligned with the CID descriptor. There may be instances where maybe one item of content is missing, whether the textbooks might be outdated, in which case you might get a conditionally approved determination where colleges would then have to revise their course outline, resubmit it for re-review, and then hopefully ultimately approval. There is a timeline associated with these conditional approvals. It's 1 year. The final determination is not approved, and these are in instances where there is a fundamental difference between the course outline that was submitted and the CID descriptor. Examples include, for example, a course that requires a lab, but there's no lab in the course outline that was submitted, or perhaps it's the wrong level. So maybe a non-majors course or a course that is I guess majors versus non-majors is one that I typically think of if it's at the wrong level. We recognize also that each college goes through their own local curriculum review process. It's a periodic process that ranges, in time, 5-7 years usually. And as course outlines of record go through changes, many of those are not necessarily substantial and would not necessarily require resubmission to CID for re-review, But in instances where there are substantial changes to the course outline of record, for example, changes to units or content or the objectives, if they appear on your course outline, we would require that those are resubmitted to CID for re-review. This ensures the integrity of the process, and as I mentioned earlier, CID is meant to facilitate articulation between the community colleges and the CSU. And honestly, it really helps to ensure that there's ongoing constant review to ensure that any local curricular changes are still consistent with what the CID descriptors are requiring.
Eric?
Yes.
Eric, Marisa, I just want to do a quick time check that it's 11:37.
Okay, thank you. Two more slides. So the next slide here is regarding curricular innovations. Your single course outline of record that is written locally is supposed to be used to meet a broad purpose. So it's to meet all the different layers of transfer: your elective credit, your GE, course-to-course articulations, and CID. So for that reason, it's necessary to word your course outlines of record in a way to meet all of those transfer needs. I also want to point out that CID is not the be-all end-all for transfer. There are other institutes of higher education where students might be interested in transferring who don't use CID as a means of articulation. For example, UC does not. So in that case, CID is one component that will serve the needs of some of your students, but certainly not all of them. There is definitely the need to ensure that those course-to-course major level articulations, those that are separate from CID, are still honored and are still relevant. And so you have to keep that in mind when also redesigning your courses. So for all of these reasons, it's really a good idea to keep your local curriculum chair apprised of any changes that you're planning on making, and importantly, also your articulation officer, who really would be the expert in knowing what some of the nuances are with some of these particulars related to transfer. I mentioned also previously the periodic 5-year cycle, and I wanted to encourage participation from the folks here in the CSU and the community college systems. We do put out calls for reviews on a regular basis, and I encourage you to subscribe to the ASCCC listservs if you're from the community college system, so that you're aware of the need for a review and can provide input on what you and your professional opinion would be necessary to include in CID descriptors and also in transfer model curricula if appropriate. The last slide here, we'll talk about those transfer model curricula just briefly here. CID, as I mentioned, is related to the associate degrees for transfer. And why you should care is because all of your colleges offer associate degrees for transfer. Those ADTs are based on the transfer model curricula, which are the program outlines that are established and reviewed by the faculty discipline review groups. Some of those transfer model curricula specify that or whether courses must be aligned with the CID descriptor before the associate degree for transfer can be approved. And many of you may know the benefit of associate degrees for transfer. They do offer guarantee of admission to the CSU system. I do want to emphasize that it's to the system, not to a specific campus and not to a specific major on that campus. And I also wanted to also acknowledge the other institutions, private and historically Black colleges and universities. Some of those do also accept ADTs. The other benefits of ADTs is that there's a pathway that's been outlined for students who are prepared to enter the appropriate level coursework at the community college to complete that associate degree within 60 units, including general education. And then beyond that, at the CSU system, if a student is admitted with a guarantee of admission to the CSU system, that they have a pathway at that CSU campus to complete their bachelor's degree within a 60-unit threshold at the CSU campus. These 60 unit guarantees are there as a minimum, and students can, of course, opt to take more. Should they change a major or should they want to explore further in other areas, they're not prevented from taking more units if they so choose. And finally, again, the importance of CID is that it does streamline the articulation agreements, the major level course preparation for students transferring to the CSU system. Okay, so that is, I guess, a brief overview of CID. I mentioned that while we were preparing for this presentation that I presented on CID in a number of different forums, and a lot of them were more updates on what's new with CID, but never sort of this high-level background on CID in and of itself. So I realize it's a lot of content, especially for those of you who are new. So I wanted to make sure that we had time for questions.
Yeah, we have just short of 20 minutes for questions. Thanks so much for the presentation. You know, it was a lot of information. A lot of it is technical, but that's why a presentation like this, a 101, is really helpful. So thanks so much for doing that. And I realized that there have been questions in the chat. Some of them have been answered, but some are still unanswered. We're going to turn to Rob to unearth those that, you know, we can still address here. And I just wanted to mention too to folks in the audience, you know, if you have a follow-up question or something like that, please raise your hand, because you know, if we can get to your questions that are relevant to maybe what we're discussing, the questions in the chat, that would be great. So please feel free to raise your hand. Rob?
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Marisa. So as you mentioned, I think at least one has been pretty fully addressed. And one of the questions was about how to volunteer to be a part of the Fdrg groups. And so I know that someone had posted some information, some links to the Academic Senate website to get involved. So if there's any further follow-up on that, you know, I just asked to raise your hand about that, but I think that one's been fully addressed. One that from Anne was asking about who gets surveyed when faculty input is needed. In other words, to whom are the surveys sent?
Good question. So to whom are surveys sent? Within the community college system, subscription to the listservs is important. That will ensure that you get firsthand knowledge of when those surveys actually come out. You'll see the announcements usually from CID directly. Some colleges may have a system of communication sort of set up where your curriculum chair, your articulation officer, or maybe your department chair is subscribed to those listservs, and she or he may send out a link to that for you to participate. Some colleges have it organized where they have departmental meetings and they review the CID survey and then provide a departmental response. What we do is in our surveys, we collect that information, whether you're responding on behalf of yourself or on behalf of your department. We're interested also in your role. So we'll collect demographic information about whether you're in discipline or whether you're in a related discipline. We also survey the articulation officers. The perspective that an articulation officer has and the perspective that discipline faculty may have overlap in some regards, but then there's also certain things that discipline faculty are not as well aware of. For example, the nuances of articulation and transfer that your AO might know of. And so all of these are the folks from the community college system who may receive these announcements. If you're from the CSU system, we do send this to the CSU Chancellor's Office, and they have their own method of disseminating the survey to the colleges and to the discipline faculty.
Thanks, Eric. So there was just one more kind of unanswered question from a while back that I wanted to highlight. But Anne, I think we might need some additional context here. You asked the question, are assignments on CID required or representative? Eric, are you good with that, or do you need some additional context for that one?
No, I think we had this question before, and I just wanted to check if there was a follow-up regarding this, because I think we answered this one.
Oh, okay. Apologies.
Yeah, that did get answered. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, I missed that one.
No worries.
One question from Ben says, when will math descriptors be updated to reflect the AB 705 improvement plan?
So that one, I don't know if we know when the next time the math Fdrg is going to be convened. I know that they met a few years ago and they may be due soon.
They are due for their 5-year review. At this time, there's no discussion on updating any of the existing descriptors in response to AB 705. There are some descriptors on our resources tab of the CID website, and they're more to be used as a guide, not actual descriptors that you submit for.
Great. Marisa, I'm just going to keep going if that sounds good to you.
Yep, keep going. Just really quickly, I just want to mention for folks that arrived on the later side, we are recording this webinar and we're going to send the recording to everyone who has registered, as well as post it on our website.
Great. So Charles had a question about in the cores, who is the third reviewer and where does that person come from?
Yeah, so course outline of record evaluators who review the course outlines community colleges submit to CID. There's one from the community college system, one from the CSU, and then a primary reviewer. Typically, the primary reviewer is from the community college system, but there may be instances where that person is also from the CSU, or is instead from the CSU.
Great. Another one from Nancy says, when an item enters its 5-year review, how long before a determination is made on whether changes will be required? And how can we tell if a TMC or descriptor is about to change?
Good questions. The last one first, because I remember that one. I'll ask you to repeat the first one in a moment.
Sure.
So how you'll know whether a descriptor or TMC will change. I mentioned previously the listservs. When there's the initial call for input on the CID descriptors or the TMC, those will be distributed to the listserv. Those survey responses are sent back to the faculty discipline review group. And if they are considering making changes to the CID descriptors that are going to be substantial in nature, or whether there are going to be changes to the TMC that may require that will require that colleges resubmit their programs to the chancellor's office, another announcement will be sent out to those same listservs asking for input on those changes and the feasibility of it. The challenge with CID, I mean, it's a good challenge that we're working with, but we're trying to get CID to be applicable to as many of the community colleges as possible, recognizing that there's diversity in the state and how curriculum is going to be designed and how it's designed to meet the local student populations. So we want to ensure that when there are changes, those changes are still going to be useful to the broadest groups of colleges and students as possible. And sorry, I forgot the first.
Yeah, and then the first part of the question is, when it enters its 5-year review, how long before a determination is made?
Yeah, okay, so regarding the 5-year review process, that depends on a number of factors. We usually aim for it to be about a year long, maybe a year and a half process. As I mentioned, it's sort of alluded to actually, that it's an iterative process. Surveys go out, the Fdrgs need time to review the surveys and then provide input, whether there are going to be changes or not. If there are changes, we resurvey again, so that can lengthen the process a little bit. Beyond the Fdrgs, we also have articulation officers who can provide some perspective on some of the more technical aspects, if there are changes, how that might impact transferability and articulation. And then final approval rests with the ICW or ICFW, as mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. So those typically are what would lead to variability in the timeline.
Yeah, it looks like,
Nancy, oh, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say what you were going to say, Marisa. Go ahead.
I see Nancy has her hand raised. Nancy, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, so that was my question that you were just responding to. And I guess my concern is that if we are contemplating a new ADT, for example, or we have an existing one that maybe the faculty are contemplating a significant review, it's difficult to know how to advise people on whether there may be changes coming and how much work, if it's advisable to put in the work right then, or if it would be better to wait for the results of the work groups, because sometimes the work groups decide that there are no changes, or there's changes that are minimal and people don't need to do anything, or, so I just don't know how we can really tell when things are in between requesting and participation and here's the announcement with what's happened.
Yeah, if I'm understanding the concern, curriculum is dynamic. And when you're working with what may be, for maybe it's not a good analogy, but maybe a moving target, that curriculum locally is dynamic, curriculum at the state level is dynamic. How are you supposed to reconcile those two? Don't let that be an impediment to you. You design your curriculum, work with your local curriculum process to do what you need to do to meet your students' needs. If there are changes, likely you have processes in place locally to deal with change and address those as needed. But I would, if you're considering something, go for it, and submit it and see what happens. That's my best advice.
Yeah. So Eric, there's a couple of comments in the chat that are somewhat related. And so I wanted to kind of bring those to light, which are, we've also heard before expressed by some of like our Learning Lab grantees, for example, that the CID descriptors are packed with topics, right? And this person in the chat used calculus as an example. And that some have expressed that it creates challenges for them to include different instructional techniques, address their student needs appropriately. And so I just wanted to, it wasn't necessarily a question, it was a concern that was addressed, but I guess my question is, how would you respond to folks who have that concern about like this list of topics, that seems restrictive? How should they be thinking about that?
Yeah, that is a good one. I want to reiterate really that CID descriptors are not a template. And when you see topics, and it's been a long time since I had my own calculus, so it'd be far be it for me to really delve into specifics here. But from a discipline faculty perspective, you would look at that descriptor, look at how it could appear in your course outline of record. And these are the same things that we're encouraging our reviewers to do: is use your discipline expertise to review that course outline of record and see if the content here presented in the course outline of record aligns in some way with the CID descriptor. And the other thing, and maybe we should, put this in our reminders to our course outline of record evaluators, but I mentioned this in our presentation here. That single course outline that is sent to CID is also sent to GE for review. It's sent to campuses for their course-to-course articulations as well. Your colleges are not writing a course outline that is going to be sent to UC Berkeley for them to review against their calculus descriptor. That same course outline is going to Berkeley, it's going to CID, it's going to GE for all those different levels of transfer and articulation. So that's where sort of the nuanced approach to writing curriculum is important, because you have to hit all of those boxes if that's what your goal is. And so I don't know if that adequately addresses the question, but that's my best attempt at it for now.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Tim, I see that you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to reply that so in this Cell grant project that Shandy and I and our colleague Marion and all of the community college faculty have expressed that they see this they see that CID descriptor is like, oh my God, this is a list of things that I have to cover and at least touch on, otherwise I'm going to get in trouble. While I appreciate that that's not maybe the intent of the CID, I think in practice, that's kind of how that it's been our experience that that's kind of how such a document is received on the ground, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Because I want to kind of piggyback, I'm Shandy, on what Tim's saying, is that the way the CID descriptor currently reads doesn't seem to be especially nuanced about how much of the course, how do you cover it? What counts as covering what's in the list? And so, for one of the examples we talked about in our project was, if students are given projects they can do in the course, and some students are given projects of topic A, some on topic B, some on topic C, and then they share presentations in class, does that count as covering it if it didn't come out of the instructor's mouth? Right?
Those are good questions. And again, this is part of the holistic review process, that if your course outline of record is written in such a way where such a project would be a requirement of all sections that are offered, because we recognize that there's going to be differences between how instructors teach that course. If this is something that would be universally applied at a college, then write it as such in your course outline of record. And that would potentially convey to a reviewer that, okay, a student who takes this course at this college will have learned the curriculum through this method, through a project, rather than hearing it from an instructor's mouth. So again, it's the wording that counts sometimes in how this course outline of record is structured.
Well, I'm also asking the complementary, where is it in the CID that I, as a community college faculty member, understand that my course outline of record can look like that?
Yeah, so our messaging has been that CID descriptors are a minimum. And the review process is supposed to be a holistic process where the entirety of a course outline of record is considered against the CID descriptor. To the other question that just came, that I just recall here about the amount of time that's supposed to be spent on a particular topic, CID has so far been silent on that. That could potentially open up a lot of cans of worms, if we were to specify that 3 hours shall be dedicated to this topic and 6 hours to this topic. So there's some flexibility again in how much time is spent on topics. We don't require that there's a breakdown in the amount of time either.
Thank you.
We're at 11:59. I see a question from Ann Wright. I don't know if this is a quick one. If you don't include all the required topics, will your course of record be rejected? If this is a longer conversation, we can just encourage folks to contact you through the address.
Yeah, the short answer is probably. So if it doesn't include all of the content, or at least in the judgment of the discipline faculty reviewing it, if it doesn't meet the content, it'll probably come back with a conditionally approved determination, in which case the local college would then have to revise the course outline and resubmit it to CID.
All right, well, that pretty much concludes our webinar. Thanks so much to you, Eric, and also Miguel, and for all of our audience participants. Thanks for joining today. Rob dropped in the chat the address that you can submit additional questions, any follow-up questions you have for Eric. We also consider, we would also like for you all to consider joining Learning Labs Listserv through our website. Rob will put the address for that in the chat as well. So again, thank you all for your time and have a great afternoon.